There's an attempt being made here to turn the Crimean capital, Simferopol, into a sort of Kiev, but in reverse. The Parliament building now in the hands of dozens of apparently heavily armed men, protecting it from what they see as profoundly undemocratic forces. Their supporters not so many, but very eager to tell you that they would like nothing more than Russian tanks on the streets to protect them.
That's okay, yes, because American army was supported in different countries. Today we support Russian army because every one of us has relatives in Russia.
The police line, staffed by just a handful of uncertain-looking men, didn't look very impressive. This small group proved just how unimpressive it was. The point being that they wanted to tell the armed group in charge of Parliament that they were with them and that they were in control. So it's pretty obvious exactly who's in charge here. The police line, such as it was, simply melted away as these people obviously said they wanted to hold their protests right in front of the building, which is under control of this apparently armed militia. At the moment here, there's nobody to stop them doing more or less what they feel like. There's now a daily protest as well outside the administrative building in the port of Sevastopol. Today's surprise guest, Sergei Mironov, hardline Russian nationalist and member of the Russian parliament. In he went for talks with the Russian mayor in this supposedly Ukrainian city. This woman could barely disguise her fury at the takeover of her country. Those people from the West, we educated them, she said. They could barely read before we taught them. These people genuinely think that they're now being governed by a bunch of fascist sympathising peasants. The Berkut special forces, supposedly disbanded after the shootings of protesters in Kiev, walk around here with faces on display. And behind all this is the sure knowledge that whatever aspirations the new government in Kiev might have, the Russians were in Crimea a long time ago. It's becoming pretty obvious now that Ukraine's in the middle of a diplomatic proxy war between the West and Russia, and as of right now you have a government in Kiev which harbours aspirations for this country one day perhaps to join the European Union. But if that happened, it would be a European Union country with a Russian fleet on its southern edge. And so did this local pro-Russian politician think the naval forces would ever leave them? It's impossible, he said, and he's almost certainly right. So is Crimea on the brink of war or the brink of separation? It's hard to know, but here the Russian bloc aren't listening to a word their new leaders in Kiev have to say. Lawrence Lee, Al Jazeera, Crimea.
They were supposed to be confirming a new government, but events in Crimea initially overwhelmed the Ukraine parliament, increasingly nervous about what their overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych may have unleashed. It brought this warning from the acting president.
Anyone who tries to, and I stress anyone, to take over government buildings in Ukraine's east, west, center, south and north is going to be treated as having committed a crime against the government of Ukraine.
It was an historic day in Parliament, the election of a new cabinet, promising that the victims of violence in Independence Square had not died in vain. The newly elected Prime Minister, Arseniy Yatsenyuk, said that the country was on the brink of economic and political collapse, a staggering $37 billion missing from state coffers under Yanukovych.
Russia, the US and the UK should take on responsibility under the Budapest Memorandum to guarantee that this will not grow into a military conflict, that no neighbouring country, under any condition, will intervene in the internal affairs of Ukraine.
Ukraine now desperately needs a strong government. The leaders here are battling to keep the country united and maintain law and order. They know that events could easily slip out of their control.
Some of the new cabinet may be veterans of the protest movement, but they are inexperienced in parliamentary politics. Senior colleagues don't underestimate the task ahead.
We count on the support and the cooperation from the IMF, European Union and some major powers in helping Ukraine to cope with the situation.
Beyond the crisis in Crimea, the Ukraine government needs $35 billion in international aid to keep the economy afloat. Its new ministers will be powerless without it. Tim Friend, Al Jazeera, Kiev.
If any country, Ukraine for example, was wondering about Russia's military capabilities, well, conveniently, there's a display going on right now. Vladimir Putin put 2 of Russia's 4 military districts on high alert on Wednesday, land, sea and air power being tested for readiness. Moscow insists the war games aren't connected to events in Ukraine, though NATO issued a warning against escalation.
I urge Russia not to take any action that could escalate tension or create misunderstanding. I urge the new Ukrainian leadership to continue its efforts to establish an inclusive political process that reflects the democratic aspirations of the entire Ukrainian people.
On the streets of Moscow, there was concern about the heightened tensions, but solidarity with Ukraine's ethnic Russians, particularly those in Crimea.
I think Russia should help our Ukrainian friends to get back to normal life. How exactly? I think that political leaders should decide, and they shouldn't let fascism take over or anything like what's happening right now. It's just a nightmare.
On one hand, there are brothers, but on the other hand, it can cause an international conflict. It's important to keep the territorial integrity, but we can't leave our friends in trouble.
And where is the man who still calls himself Ukraine's rightful president?
A Russian newspaper claims that he was spotted here at this rather grand Moscow hotel earlier on in the week. It's rather fittingly known as the Hotel Ukraina. Now, the establishment's management has denied that he's been there recently, but if he was, he's probably moved on now.
Maybe to here, a luxury village cum sanatorium on the outskirts of the capital called Barvicha. But if there was any doubt that Yanukovych is in Russia, it was squashed late on Thursday when the state news agency announced that he's to give a press conference in the southern city of Rostov-on-Don at 13 GMT on Friday. Rory Challens, Al Jazeera, Moscow.
NATO defence ministers in Brussels for what was always going to be a difficult meeting on their future plans in Afghanistan, but their agenda further complicated by the fast-moving events of recent days in Ukraine. Adding to the concern among the 28 nations represented here, news that former President Yanukovych is in Russia and reports of Russian military movements near the Ukrainian border.
We expect other nations to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and avoid provocative actions. That's why I'm closely watching Russia's military exercises along the Ukrainian border.
A thinly veiled warning to Russia too in London, where UK Prime Minister David Cameron was attending a joint news conference with German Chancellor Angela Merkel.
We are particularly concerned by the situation in Crimea. Every country should respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the Ukraine. Russia has made that commitment, and it's important that Russia keeps its word. The world will be watching.
US Secretary of State John Kerry was also meeting his German counterpart. At the best of times, relations between the West and Russia can be tricky, but Kerry is known to have a good rapport with the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Once again, he's been called on to diffuse tensions. The two men spoke by phone.
With respect to the events and the takeover of the Rada today, yes, of course, we talked about it. And he had said, he indicated to me that he'd actually watched it on TV and he'd seen what had happened, but he disclaimed that they had anything to do with any formal Russian initiative, and on the contrary, they're concerned about it.
Diplomats here and around the world will watch developments in the coming hours extremely closely. Possible comments from former President Yanukovych, if it happens, his first public appearance since he was ousted, and from his Russian hosts, could shape the way things develop at this delicate time for East-West relations. James Bays, Al Jazeera at the United Nations.
Let's get more on this very dramatic unfolding situation in Ukraine and the presence of 2,000 Russian troops in the Crimea. Lawrence Lee is in Simferopol in the Crimea, and he joins me on the line. Lawrence, I believe you are on the way to the airport. Can you tell us what it is you are hearing about the developments and what it is that you're seeing at the moment?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of things happening at the same time since our reports much earlier in the day about the apparent takeover of the two airports, the civilian airports at Simferopol and the military airport at Sevastopol. Into this evening, Ukraine time, there have been a variety of reports of other things that have apparently happened, which have all led to the continued assumption that there is a sort of a direct assault, perhaps from Russian forces or from Russian forces, to try to get more and more control of Crimea. And these have been a number of things. We've heard reports of flights from Kiev to Simferopol being cancelled, of phone lines being cut between the two places. We're actually driving around Simferopol at the moment trying to verify some of these things ourselves. One report from a little earlier on said that the state's TV channel here, which is run by Ukraine, had been taken over by military forces or forces of some sort loyal to Russia. What we saw a minute or two ago was a TV station that was in darkness, and through the darkness we saw a couple of men walking away from us in what we thought were military fatigues. We're now on our way to the Tatar TV channel. The Tatars are people who live in Crimea who've been beleaguered and under the Russian Kosh for generations. They have now surrounded that TV channel with their own people to try to protect it from being taken over. And we're hearing other reports of troop movements and personnel carriers, not APCs, but troop wagons in the center of Simferopol, and we haven't quite got there yet. But there is this general sense now, if you look at it from the point of view of the new government in Kiev, that Crimea is under attack from Russia. If you look at it from the Russian point of view, it's that they're trying to protect the Russians here from people who they would see as being terrorists and fascists who are now governing in Ukraine, in Kiev.
Yes, I was going to ask you to remind us about why Russia would be taking such interest in the developments in Ukraine and holding on to the Crimea, why it wants such a grip there.
Well, if you want to go back 250 years, Crimea was first taken by Catherine the Great for Russia, and it was controlled and owned by Russia and was Russian territory up until 1954, when it was given back to Ukraine by Khrushchev, who was then the Soviet leader. And actually, Crimea has only been part of Ukraine from 1954 until now. And so from the long-term historical Russian perspective, it is part of Russia. And if you take a different perspective from the modern day, and as we know, all politicians like to turn a crisis into an opportunity, there is an increasingly held view that the opportunity, as seen from Moscow, was to turn the revolution in Maidan into an opportunity to bring Crimea back into their fold, since they believe that historically it really belongs to them and not to Ukraine.
Lawrence Lee reporting on the troop movements within Crimea. Thank you for that, Lawrence Lee.
Hello, I'm Sami Zaidan in Doha with a look at the top stories here on Al Jazeera. Ukraine is accusing Russia of invading Crimea. Russian transport planes have reportedly landed troops in the semi-autonomous region. Russian military helicopters were also seen, and armored personnel carriers are on the streets. US President Barack Obama said he was deeply concerned. But the Russians say they're acting within their rights. The United Nations Security Council is calling for urgent international mediation. James Bay sent this update from New York.
The Security Council meeting was a closed session. It took place behind closed doors. The Russians didn't even want this meeting to take place. At the end, they could come up with no agreement at all, not even an agreed set of words, as they sometimes do on a subject like this. And it's clear that there was division around the Security Council table, division between the Western powers, which say that Russia must show that it's not got any hostile intent towards Ukraine, and Russia, which of course has a veto at the Security Council table, meaning that any action on Ukraine is unlikely. Diplomats, though, tell me they expect the Security Council to try to revisit this subject in the coming days.
The latest security video revealing the moment that armed Russian sympathizers took over the parliament building in the Crimean capital. Now unconfirmed reports of thousands of Russian troops moving into Ukraine's autonomous republic. This amateur footage reportedly shows Russian military helicopters flying into Crimea. The growing crisis brought this response from President Obama.
We are now deeply concerned by reports of military movements taken by the Russian Federation inside of Ukraine. Russia has a historic relationship with Ukraine, including cultural and economic ties, and a military facility in Crimea. But any violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity would be deeply destabilizing, which is not in the interest of Ukraine, Russia, or Europe. It would represent a profound interference in matters that must be determined by the Ukrainian people. It would be a clear violation of Russia's commitment to respect the independence and sovereignty and borders of Ukraine and of international laws.
The fear amongst politicians here in Kiev is that Russia has now embarked on the annexation of Crimea. Whether that happens quickly over the coming days or gradually over the coming weeks and months in a war of attrition, they can see part of their country possibly slipping away from their control.
In Crimea, tension built throughout the day after troops in unmarked uniforms entered 2 airports. By late evening, it prompted this strong response from the acting Ukraine president.
The Russian Federation has begun open aggression against our country. On the pretense of training, they've brought their military to the Crimea. They've not only seized the parliament of the Crimea, they're trying to take over the control of the civilian services and communications. And they're trying to block Ukraine's military bases.
President Putin, in telephone conversations with Western leaders, insists he wants to avoid an escalation in Crimea. But at the UN, his ambassador said the crisis was not their fault.
Well, of course, as you know, we have an agreement with Ukraine on the presence of the Russian Black Sea Fleet with a base in Sebastopol, and we're acting within the framework of that agreement.
Ukraine's new leadership says it will not be provoked into a military response. Everyone is desperate to achieve a diplomatic solution, but events on the ground could make that increasingly difficult. Tim Friend, Al Jazeera, Kiev.
For a few hours on Friday, Rostov-on-Don in southern Russia became the centre of the media universe. Busloads of journalists from far and wide came to see and hear a man whose whereabouts have been the subject of intense speculation for days. A man who still speaks as if he's president.
Nobody ousted me. I was forced to leave Ukraine because my life and the lives of those dear to me were under threat. As you are aware, power in Ukraine has been seized by nationalists, pro-fascist youngsters representing a minority in Ukraine.
Of the crisis in Crimea, Viktor Yanukovych had this to say.
I call on Crimeans to prevent bloodshed and quarrelling, and as an acting president, I want to declare that Crimea must remain part of the Ukrainian government, preserving its autonomy.
He said he hadn't ordered police to fire on protesters in Independence Square, but regretted he hadn't had the power or strength to keep Ukraine stable. Russia, he feels, should help.
I think Russia must act, and knowing the character of Vladimir Putin, I'm surprised that he has been so silent. This is a question.
He urged against military intervention, but said he intends to keep fighting for the future of a country that is no longer safe for him.
So the man still calling himself the legitimate president of Ukraine has spoken. But what he said is unlikely to have changed many minds, particularly those of the people in Kiev currently holding the reins of power, trying to keep their country together. For them, Ukraine's future may be worrying and it may be uncertain, but the one thing they're sure of is that it doesn't include Viktor Yanukovych. Rory Challens, Al Jazeera, Rostov-on-Don in southern Russia.